our esteemed guests, and then we'll just flow with the conversation.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Tarek. My name is Mary. I'm the project manager at Millions. And today is a bit of an experiment, so thank you all for joining. We are going to start off, as Tarek mentioned, by modeling a dialogue about a difficult topic, that topic being the Second Amendment. We have our senior policy advisor, Dr. Jonathan Metzl, here, and he has invited his friend Joe, who's also on camera, I believe, to talk about the Second Amendment, gun control. They, from my understanding, have very different opinions on the matter, so they will share their own opinions, and they will kind of model what that dialogue looks like. And then after listening to them for about 20 minutes, we will break out into 4 moderated groups, and we will discuss both our opinions on the Second Amendment as well, but also the ways that we found helpful in their engagement and how we learned from how Dr. Metzl and Joe spoke to one another, even though they disagreed. So I will hand it over to Dr. Metzl and Joe. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. It's so great to be here. It's kind of funny because Joe Marr is my dear friend. So we're kind of cheating because we played softball together for 20 years and we disagree on a lot of stuff. And so I think the take home for me, first of all, he doesn't know me as Dr. Metzl, thankfully. He just knows me as Jonathan. And I would say that the interesting part is we lived in Michigan. I lived in Michigan. Now he's in Michigan and I'm in New York, but I teach in Tennessee. And we became friends in a totally different arena where your politics didn't really matter. We played on a softball team together for about 10 years. But I think the interesting thing is if we would have met each other on Twitter, Joe, wouldn't you say? Like, there's no way in the world, because we, you know, like, there's like not one thing we probably would send the same tweet on, except for like that the Kansas City Royals suck. And so, and so we're coming at this from very, very different perspectives. But also, I think the important thing for me before we get into this is just having studied this stuff myself for my book, you know, and for my life and stuff like that. How much Twitter puts us in Kansas, and maybe after 20 minutes from now, we'll actually end up actually hating each other. But I would say that you know, Twitter thrives on conflict, but if you know people in the real world, things seem more doable. So that's my sense. I don't know, Joe, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's totally right. You know, I think that social media specifically is difficult in that you get this kind of very small snapshot into somebody. And, you know, I think that's absolutely the case. If we met each other on social media, I don't know that we'd be having this conversation.
So let's first of all give a shout out to the actual real world. You guys might remember that world from before the pandemic. But that's where you actually meet people in places other than on Twitter. So we're gonna talk today about guns and the Second Amendment, which is something that you and I would say pretty differently, politically and just personally. And so there's 2 parts to the first question that I thought we might devise, and I'm using kind of a modified Tarek, if that's okay. And the first is really, could you explain your position, and then I'll explain my position, and then we're going to try an experiment of explaining each other's positions. But could you just explain just briefly what your experience is, how you feel about guns and the Second Amendment, what role it plays in your life, and how you came to those opinions, and now kind of how that shapes your life now? Sure.
So, you know, Jonathan mentioned, or Dr. Metzl mentioned, you know, I am from Michigan. I live in Michigan now. And, you know, guns have been a part of my life since I was a little kid, frankly. You know, I am a hunter. I have, just beyond me here is 16 acres of woods that my family and I live on to hunt. And so, you know, it's always been a normal part of my life, not in the sense that guns are a feature in necessarily daily life, although it is often, but, you know, grew up target shooting, grew up hunting, grew up doing all of that stuff. And it's stuff that I enjoy now, you know, and I think that has shaped my perspective on it. I think the other, you know, piece that has shaped my perspective on it is more the defense piece as well, knowing that there are areas, I'm sitting in one of them right now, that are really rural. And so there is an aspect to it of defense in that if I were to call, say, 911, it would be 20 minutes before there were anybody to arrive here. So, you know, that has been a big part of my upbringing. It's a big part of the culture here, you know, and I'd say that has definitely shaped my view on guns.
And just two follow-ups to that really quickly, and then I'll do the same thing. What roles do guns play in your life now? You're a gun owner. You know, how many weapons do you own, or how do you get them? How do you think about them? And then also just your sense of the politics of guns, because Mary mentioned gun control, which is, you know, complicated, but just the sense of the bigger politics around guns.
Yeah, so I mean, I have, you know, it's kind of interesting because I equate it to almost like, and it's going to sound funny, but almost like shoes or footwear in a sense, because the more things you do that involve a gun, a lot of times it involves a different caliber, a different type, a different. So, you know, somebody might hear how, I don't even know how many I have, but somebody might hear that, and it's not something crazy, but somebody might hear how many I have and be like, wow, that's a lot. But then when you consider, you know, that I hunt turkey and I hunt deer and I hunt small game, and, you know, there's a number of just kind of, you know, pests that you take care of around a property with it. It starts to sound more reasonable, kind of like somebody who has softball cleats and hiking shoes and dress shoes and sandals and all of that. So it's, you know, the number isn't always as important, but, you know, the politics around it, you know, has really been something that, you know, we've talked a lot about it, Jonathan. And it's not something that I'm like totally opposed to any sort of control, but, you know, there are specific things that I could talk about, you know, relative to policy that I'd really just like to see the government do what they have currently available to them really well before we started to enact a lot more different regulation.
Cool. And the last thing before I'll do the exact same thing, and you can interview me. Second Amendment.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, so I think that, you know, frankly, when I read the Second Amendment, there is a defensive aspect to it. And so sometimes I do think that gets discounted and kind of framed around, oh, it's just, you know, so people like me can hunt. You know, and I know times have changed, but I do still think that is a very important component of the Second Amendment, and, you know, the well-regulated militia and the right to keep and bear arms. In that line, it's, you know, it's truly a defensive element against people and against the government. And while that is like a weird kind of thing to say, I do think it's important framing, and it kind of taints the conversation, especially, you know, for people who I see address it directly towards, well, why would you need an AR-15 for hunting? Or why would you need X amount of guns for hunting? It's just, you know, it's a little more complicated than just, yep, the Second Amendment allows people to hunt.
Cool. All right. Well, you can grill me here for a couple minutes. I mean, I would say that there are a couple things I want to pick up on what you said. But maybe I'll just, I'll start with mine, and then you can maybe ask me some follow-up questions, and then we'll do a couple of these other questions here. But, you know, I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri. And on one hand, guns could not have been farther from my life, right? And my mom is a New Yorker who still thinks she's a New Yorker. She's only lived in Kansas City for 50 years now. She grew up in Queens, and my dad dragged her back to Kansas City, you know, for heteronormativity. But she still thinks of herself as a New Yorker. And as a New Yorker, she just can't imagine why anybody would need a gun. We also live in the city in Kansas City. My dad is a Holocaust survivor from Europe, and so he grew up with just a lot of bad experiences escaping the Nazis who had guns and they didn't, and stuff like that. So he's totally. It's not anti-gun, but the interesting thing is, like, I grew up in Kansas City, right? And Kansas City is not New York, and it's not Los Angeles. It's kind of red state America. We grew up like the only Jewish family for miles in Kansas City, and on one hand, you weren't, when we were growing up, you weren't pro-gun or anti-gun. Like, that wasn't really a thing where I grew up. It was more like either you had a family that had a history, a tradition of guns, or you didn't have guns. Like, it wasn't this big contested thing. And so two things happened for me growing up that kind of shaped my opinion. One is just kind of random. When I was like 13 or 14, we were at a music festival and there were some kids doing target practice like a mile away with a high capacity rifle, and they were shooting at cans, but they missed the cans and the bullets were ripping through the music tent, and a couple people got shot, like like where we were. Like we actually, when I was a kid, I saw some people get shot, just kind of in a random accident that nobody really intended, except that make sure you have some sandbags behind where you're shooting, and these kids didn't know it. And so first was like a kind of terror, which was the first time I'd ever thought about guns. Um, and then I guess the other part is growing up in Kansas City also, I just started to see like this NRA politics take over in a way where initially it wasn't that big of a deal. Like either you had guns for hunting or you didn't. But then there were all this ratcheting up of like, I mean, I keep thinking of the words of Wayne LaPierre that a good guy with a gun needs to protect himself against a bad guy with a gun. But when they would talk about who the bad guy was, it was always a gang banger or a carjacker, like these very racist and racialized terms. And so people started like mistrusting other people when they started hearing this kind of language. And while that was happening, there were all these ads, in magazines and stuff like to restore the balance of power, to be a good citizen protector, all these things. So it really meant a lot to people, and they started fearing other people. And so people would run out and just buy like crazy, Missouri is like one of the top 3 states for what are called gun super owners, 30 or more weapons.
Okay.
And when you would ask people like, why do you need guns? They'd be like, well, somebody's going to gangbang me or carjack me or something. And so in a way, I guess what I saw was like the breakdown of this, like people used to kind of congregate in places like public parks. And when guns, it's not even about shootings. It's really about what happened when everybody needed guns against each other. That all of a sudden people stopped trusting each other. And so I would consider myself a centrist. Like I respect that people have the Second Amendment. I respect that there are people who grew up with guns and use them for all kinds of reasons. But I feel like, I keep thinking there's this Pew opinion poll that like 20 years ago, like 75% of gun owners said they had it for hunting, and like 20% said they need it for self-defense. And now it's like 85% of people say they need it for self-defense. And that's particularly true in the pandemic, where now everybody and their grandmother has a gun now. And so
Yeah.
for me, it's more just about it's more just about like the Second Amendment is one thing, but the way this is expanded by, it just taps into racial undercurrents and commercial things and stuff like that. So I don't know. I hate to divide this into like good gun owners and bad owners, but I don't know. It seems to me like maybe that's kind of what I'm doing or something. I don't know. And so for me, I guess I would say I'm for like some kind of middle ground, but it seems like you can't find it because everybody's pushed to the polls. And on the other side, I've seen people who've never encountered guns in their life all of a sudden be for like all these crazy gun policies that I know people back in Missouri would never go for. Doing away with all kinds of guns and stuff like that. And I think it makes sense in New York, but it doesn't make sense in other places where people, the people who you're going to impact are the people who own guns. So I would consider myself kind of trying to think through this to find a middle ground. But I don't know. Does that sound extreme to you?
No, I think that, I mean, I think that I don't think it's inappropriate to bucket it as like good gun owners and bad gun owners, because I think that you can bucket, I mean, the problem is the classification, but you can bucket a lot of things into that, right? Like, I think when I think through kind of policies or different things that can be done, so you have a substantial amount of people that, like kids or whoever, get injured with guns every year. And I know a big focus for me, I'm a gun owner, I also have kids, my guns are locked up, like it's very important for that to be, for there to be safety there. And I think it's pretty reasonable to expect that people abide by that kind of mentality of, okay, the guns need to be safe, and so I think the hard part, when I think about gun control, for example, the hard part about it is you think about gun control, or I hear about different different things. And it's really difficult when, I looked it up before we had our conversation, like in 2000, there's the NICS program just nationally, so if I go to the store and buy a gun, my name gets run through the national database. And
But the background, just for people who don't know, it's the background check system.
yeah, and so there is this background check component, but the government does an awful job of holding anybody accountable with it. In 2018, there was like 12 people nationally that they pressed charges for some sort of NICS or gun buying violation. So, that to me is like, it is frustrating in a sense, because I hear a lot of people calling for something like a national background check system, which makes sense, but we're not even leveraging the current one that's in place. And that's frustrating to somebody who does know guns. The other component is when I hear like a focus on, let's say, a number or that sort of thing. For the reason I described earlier around different uses, there is a utility and a tool element to it. It doesn't necessarily affect anything to restrict the number of guns somebody can buy. There's just not a lot of utility that I see there as a gun owner and somebody who cares about that safety element as well. So, I think there is some middle ground to be talked about, but it is about, like, at some point the policymakers have to talk to the people who are subject to the policies and find that middle ground. And that, I think, has been really difficult, because you do have the NRA influencing things from the right, and you have, coastal elites or whatever the NRA would call them influencing it from the left. I think it just makes it really difficult.
And so because I wonder about this too, and I could be critical of my side. I mean, in a way, this is kind of, again, Tarek, forgive me, I'm modifying the questions a little bit. But what would that compromise look like? Because I guess the frustration I'll just speak for the quote unquote gun control side, even though I feel like that's a misnomer. Is that, for example, the background check system sucks because it's been massively defunded by the Republicans, right? And so
right.
all the data entering has been destroyed by underfunding, and so there's no way that system's going to work, not because the government is evil or overreach, but because very conscious reason why that program sucks. And so
right.
And I think that for me, there have been attempts to find a middle ground that kind of try to bridge both sides. Another example for me are what are called red flag laws. There was a big study out today that showed that red flag laws, for people who don't know, they're family members who are worried that somebody is spiraling down can basically enact a process that will restrict guns to people for a month to get an assessment. And initially, Lindsey Graham was for it, and all these Republicans were for it, and the thing was, it was only a temporary move, and so and the key thing, I study gun suicide, as you know, is that guns in the house are probably the number one predictor of a gun suicide, because it's hard to commit a gun suicide if you don't have a gun in your house, really hard, but also it's a temporary crisis very often. The issue is, like, people who commit gun suicide, for example, it's 59 minutes or less. It's not like I've been to therapy my whole life. It's like I got drunk, I got fired, my wife's having an affair, or something like that. And so these temporary restraining orders were effective, and also it didn't impinge on anybody's Second Amendment right, because when the crisis passed, they could get their guns back. But then the NRA, as you know, has gone subterranean on this thing, totally destroyed the whole thing. And now everybody who was for it is against it. And so I would say there's a little bit of a frustration about what is a middle ground when we're not allowed to have a middle ground, if that makes sense. And so the positions become like ridiculous parodies. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's about the commitment to the actual policy, because I think you could use the reverse of that defunding argument to, like, shoot down an additional background check legislation, like, right? Because you could say, okay, well, yeah, I guess it's a priority now, but what happens when they just defund that too? And so it kind of it's this circle of just hopelessness on, okay, we'll have something as a priority now, but ultimately it won't be. And it, so I mean, I think the compromise, I do remember, like, the red flag, what mass shooting was it that it was like really popular and bipartisan? Was it Las Vegas?
It was Sandy Hook. Sandy Hook.
Sandy Hook. Okay,
Yeah.
because it was like in the aftermath of that I do remember, like, it was bipartisan kind of compromise to that. And I think that because we really can't focus on anything, on like more than one thing at a time, it just kind of evaporates quickly, and nothing ever happens. So I think there is like a compromise that happens just because people know it'll go away. But from a practical element, I would really like to see, like, if we're going to do the background check thing, like, shore up NICS, allow and make sure that different agencies talk to one another. There's been a number of them now that have happened where the person shouldn't have been approved through NICS, but were, because they're the different elements of the government weren't talking to each other. And so, from my end, my perspective is that before I give the government any more authority over my day-to-day life, I want them to be a good steward of the things that they already can control. And if they're not controlling those things very well, then to me, they're not a good steward of my support in controlling something else. So, even before there would be something larger around red flag laws, I'd really want them to see or to commit to what they're doing now, or get rid of it, and reform it that way. I know that's kind of, that's the libertarian in me.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's
Yeah.
and it's good to hear. I mean, because, and I'll just say one more thing, and then there are two other specific questions not linked with the guns
Sure.
that I'm going to ask you. We have a couple more minutes, is that right? And so for me, part of the issue is there's the two frustrations for me about it are number one is that there's been this ban on research for about 4 decades.
Yeah.
And so there probably are middle grounds that we could figure out. Like, I would love to do research as a gun researcher on what do people enjoy about having a gun, but
Yeah.
what how does a gun change a social interaction? Like, I wanted to do, when you can have loaded guns in bars in Tennessee. I was curious to do research, like, how does that change somebody's pickup line in a bar when they walk in, something like that. So I think, but the thing is, there's like, we don't know anything, right? And that's
Right.
number one, is that there's been a ban, a silencer on knowledge.
Yeah.
That makes these conversations hard. Like, everybody's winging it themselves.
Well,
And the other thing is that it's kind of like what narrative dominates, right? Because for a long time it was think about, if we're going to enact gun control, it's going to impact gun owners, because if you don't need it, if you're in New York, because you don't have guns already. And so in a way, it was kind of like one side doing it to the other side without consulting. And now with this Barrett Supreme Court expanding the Heller decision, it's going to go in the opposite, which is they're going to broaden Heller, and it's going to overturn all the gun laws in New York and Los Angeles. And so in a way, this other ideology, so the dynamics of this are never free of this bigger political frame. And so I don't know, I wish we could have more conversations like this, but it's hard because everything feels impossible in terms of polarization.
Yeah, well, and that's, I think, the ultimate point of agreement is, I'm a researcher, data scientist myself. Like, that is truly a concern when there's an inability to research it at all, because I mean, it really does impact people's ability to find a common ground and get behind people, or even consult with people who have any clue about what's actually happening empirically.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the one last thing I'll say, and then Tarek, I'll hand it back to you. Or do you want me to ask about model citizen and citizenship? Do you guys want me to ask that? There were two other questions on the list.
That's, we maybe we can ask those in the breakout groups. I'll send them
Okay,
to the moderators.
sure,
It might be a
perfect.
good conversation for them.
Okay, perfect. Well, I mean, I think that one thing I'll say, critical of, like, quote unquote my side, is that people rushed in with legislation about guns, but they never asked, like, what do guns mean?
Right.
And so I think part of the issue is like, what do guns mean to people who own them? You know what I mean? Like that would have made a lot of research better, but ultimately we fall into these fake binaries of like one side wants safety and the other side wants death, or
Right.
like all these fake things that
Right.
you would think if you live on Twitter, but you would never know. So I don't know. Last question for me. How do you feel about the future of this? Optimistic, pessimistic, guarded? What do you see coming down the pike?
Um, I'm pessimistic that anything uh, is gonna really change. You know, I just think that there's in a lot of different avenues right now, there's a real difficulty in bringing anybody together to look at anything objectively, because I think there is questions to be asked about what guns mean. They mean different things in different places. And what's the forum to kind of talk about that? Because what it's resulted in right now you know, is kind of hard and fast rules on both sides and legislation that comes across that reads to the average gun owner like kind of a joke, and that's a problem. So, I'm kind of pessimistic, regardless of what happens on November 3rd about any sort of change. But I guess we'll see. How about you?
I'm pessimistic, and I'm pessimistic actually because of the courts, because I think the
Yeah,
courts are
sure.
going to dictate a lot of this stuff. Believe it or not, I'm going to make a states' right argument that I think different locales should have the right to set their own gun
Yes.
laws. And I think the minute you start putting this in the Constitution, they're going to broaden Heller. They're going to make a national right to carry. Places like New York are all of a sudden going to have a bunch of unconstitutional gun laws, and they're going to be guns on the subway. For me, that is the wrong thing here, right? So I think the fact that the Supreme Court is going to get into it this way, for me, just scares the bejesus out of me, because then these kind of conversations become, I don't know, it seems to me like it seems to me like it just the tenor of this, the framework, in other words, it's not you and me
Yeah.
talking, it's that the frame around this thing doesn't allow us to have any agreement in a way that matters, because the frame is so polarized.
Right.
It's a zero sum formulation, like there's either
Right.
a winner or a loser, which sucks when you want to find a middle ground.
Well, and here's the thing is like we've just kind of, I mean, we know, you and I know that there's a middle ground between like uh taking all the guns that I have or anybody else has, and there's a middle ground. I work right across the street from the Michigan Capitol, and there's a middle ground between like taking all the guns and actually entering the Capitol with guns like we saw during COVID. And so, there is this huge amount of space between those two positions, that the perception just is that there's not.
Yeah, well, anyway, it'll be interesting what happens. I mean, I read the study this morning that the expansion in gun ownership is so unprecedented, and it doesn't break down on party lines. Like there are a lot of liberal people with no gun training who now have guns in their house. Who
I've had no joke over the pandemic. I've had two friends from college who I wouldn't call them conservative, ask me about how do I buy a gun once I have a gun? Where do I get it? Like, and that's scary from somebody who is a gun owner, has been for a long time, is proficient with the guns that I own, and spend a lot of time to be that way, because I think that's what you have to do to own guns. It's pretty scary to know that there's just a bunch of people out there buying guns with no ammo to practice, no knowledge. Like, that's pretty scary.
Yeah, you're gonna have to protect yourself from the liberals pretty soon.
Okay,
Anyway,
so I'm going to just jump in here. Thank you so much for that discussion. I think it's always interesting, because I think if we talk about policy from a grassroots perspective, I think we get really far, and then it gets complicated as soon as you have corporate agendas or political agendas, and that's where it gets complicated. At the same time, as someone was mentioning in the comments, is that we're not going into in-depth policy, where the devil lies in the details, and then that's where the conflict comes. But we have an hour, so I really appreciate the way you're able to exchange. So what we're going to do now is we're going to break people up. So actually, maybe we'll be able to have more of a conversation. I'll try to make sure Joe and Jonathan are not in the same breakout group. So what's the math, Mary? How many groups with how many people did we say?
It should be around 8 people in each group, so we could do 4 groups.
4 breakout rooms?
Mhm.
Okay, I'll do 4, and I'll do assign automatically, and then I'll have to shuffle because of some of the moderators. And do we have 4 moderators?
Yes, so Mark Dahlhaus, Manal Omar, Margaret Tizak, and Yasmin Mukhahal are
Okay.
all
So
moderators.
please bear with us. You're gonna get automatically shuffled, and just wait 2-3 minutes until I get everybody in the right place before I randomly move people in the middle of the conversation. So I'm about to create 4 rooms, and then I might shuffle you a bit. So bear with us. Oh, I can shuffle before I create the rooms. Okay, sorry. So who is the first moderator name you said?
Mark Dahlhaus.
Okay, Mark. Yeah, okay. And then the second one?
Margaret Tizak.
Margaret. Yes, okay. Third one?
Manal Omar.
Okay, fourth one?
Yasmin, and I think that she changed her first name to moderator, so should be an easy one.
Move to room 4. And then I'll just check where Jonathan and then Joe. Perfect. Okay, I think this should work. Okay, we're opening the rooms. Okay, so now the idea is basically to discuss what you've just heard and the way you've heard it. I mean, for me, I think what would be wonderful from this hour is not necessarily to solve the gun issue in the United States, but to maybe talk about how we model conversations like this, that we can take it forward. What are some of the principles we can use and learn to better our communication? Okay, so you are all going to be sent to your rooms now.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Hey, room 4.
My video, the camera doesn't work on mine, but I can see you and hear you.
Awesome. So I'm a moderator. Mary, since you're here,
I'm here.
do I just like go through?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Perfect. So I'm glad everyone is here. Let's see. How did listening to disagreement make you feel?
I didn't really hear anything I disagreed with, I don't think. I respect Joe and his right to own hunting guns. And, I have no problem with that. I live in an urban environment. I'm pretty anti-gun otherwise. Yeah, so I don't know if we have any QAnon members here that are really crazy right-wing gun nuts, but I guess that's not a good way to describe people in a group discussion.
No, it's good. So it's safe space. Safe space.
I like the way they both told their personal stories, right? It goes back to how they grew up. A lot of times you don't understand people's personal stories, how it shapes how you think. And the fact that neither of them were yelling, they were talking in a very calm voice, makes a huge difference.
Absolutely. They were able to understand each other's perspectives and where they stand.
I think it's interesting because I think they came to the conversation with that agenda, right? Mm-hmm. They didn't show up ready to try and convert the other person. They were we're just going to exchange our views respectfully. This is the pledge to listen all over again. And that's it, right? But the earlier point is it's hard to find spaces to have those conversations today because social media is not set up for that. And anyway.
What do you feel was missing from this conversation?
Do we want to talk about data? Like I posted some stuff in the chat about, the stuff you all know already about homes with guns are much more likely to be subject to, homicides and suicides using the guns that are already in the home than ones without guns. So that kind of is an argument against having guns for security, although it's probably different where Joe lives than it is where I live. But there is so much, data out there that talk about.
I think that so I've known Jonathan for a long time, which I think obviously brings a base level of respect. And I'd like to say that I'd bring that to the conversation with but you never know. And I think that if we had talked longer, where we would have had more like disagreement is, so I'm not a QAnon like gun nut. That's not who I am. But like, I do believe that guns serve a defensive purpose. And while that's not my primary use of firearms, I don't necessarily disagree with that use either. And so I do think him and I would have had more of a disagreement on that. We could have talked through that. But, I do think that is something that I would get across.
So Joe, you said you had locked up guns in your house. You kept them all in a locker. Do you have any guns that are not locked up in your house? Like handguns on the nightstand or anything like that?
No, so I do have a gun safe in my room.
Right.
It's quick access, but it's not, it's secure. I mean,
Right.
A lot of it comes down to, it's a cost barrier for some folks too, because that is expensive. Otherwise they would be locked up and it would be purely non-defensive. But, so that's a cost issue too, but yeah, so.
Yeah. I was just curious whether, we keep our hunting guns in the closet in this safe, but we keep a handgun under the pillow,
No, no, they're all locked. They're all locked. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. They're all locked.
Staying on the meta conversation about the conversation, seeing actual points of disagreement, right? Like once you guys got to the middle ground of like Jonathan saying, every policy put forth by every politician, a Democratic politician, isn't what he supports, and you saying there's some form of gun control that is acceptable. It would have been interesting to see when you were just like, no, these are my, these are the hard lines, and how you navigated that. Just
sure. And I mean, if it's helpful, we can talk through that. I don't want to take over I think that's a great question, because the hard lines that I would have communicated in that is, it's kind of twofold. So let's assume that the federal government decided they were going to reinvest and recommit to something like NICS. Even it could be called NICS, but different, right? They just decided they were going to fund it, and they were going to ensure that different federal and local agencies talked to this database that everybody's running their background checks through anyway. I think it's totally appropriate to close what's typically called the gun show loophole, even the private sale loophole. So, for example, if I wanted to sell one of you a gun, one of the guns that I have, I can sell that to you and there's no record of it at all. Now, I think that's something that could be easily closed. Every firearm dealer has a federal firearms license where they have access to NICS, where they can run you through that system. And it'd be really easy to close. It would actually generate revenue for the firearm sellers. because they could charge for it, like they do if you order a gun on the internet. You don't just, it doesn't just show up at your house. You have to go to a gun store, run through NICS, and then they release it to you. So, you know, I think where my kind of line in the sand would be before I would, is those things would have to be fixed. And then the red flag laws, those would have to be structured in a very specific way for me to feel comfortable with that.
Mhm.
You know, I think that I tend to come at things from a more libertarian. I'm not like a dyed in the cloth conservative, but I do come at things from a rightward libertarian lean, and that kind of allowing the government to actually confiscate weapons or firearms in that manner makes me nervous if there's not some serious structure to how that works. But I think that would be my red line before anything else. First, fix the system, close the loopholes. Let's get our heads around that, and then talk about further stuff.
I mean, closing those loopholes would be revolutionary gun control legislation in the
Yeah.
20 years.
Yeah.
But you know, a lot of the kind of the, I won't say right wing or, you know, conspiracy theory groups would argue against having a national registration, saying that that's a way the government's going to come and take their guns away before, you know,
Right.
something, if there's some sort of armed revolution, that it makes gun ownership by them less effective.
Right.
I don't know what to do about that.
Well, and you know, the weird part about that is I'm a data scientist. If anybody with any talent whatsoever wanted to use NICS to figure out who owns firearms right now, it'd be pretty dang easy. So like the information's already there. So that's kind of like one bridge that I don't think people, like conservative folks, you see, is that it's already there. And then the other element is if it had truly come to that, would it matter? You know what and I'm not for that, but like if it truly came to the point where it was like the extreme scenario that the NRA kind of paints of the government actually confiscating firearms, I mean, I don't think it would, there'd be a lot of checkpoints before we ever got to that, in my opinion. But
so I was wondering how the conversation would have been different. Like here we have a conversation between two middle-aged white guys, and if it was racially diverse, if this, you know, because I know, being a Muslim and a person of color, that if I'm in public with a gun, I'm at risk of being shot, even though I wasn't using it in any threatening way, and things like that have happened. And so, you know, it brings another layer of controversy and disagreement and understanding of the whole situation. So like, who's in the room talking about the issue, what their background is, you know, matters. And then how do we navigate that?
Yes, that's a good point. And I would, I mean, I think this type of conversation has many layers, and 1 hour is certainly not enough, you know, to go into depth, because on a human level, why are we even having this conversation on, you know, how do we get to this point on talking about guns? Like what, okay, yes, Joe, you're a hunter. I don't know if you hunt as a sport, or if it's, if you eat, you know, what you hunt. But besides that, like why would we really need guns? But that I know is for another conversation, and it would take a while. And that's my human, I guess, interest and curiosity of why, you know, our behaviors and beliefs bring us to certain places of such fear.
I had a quick question for you, Joe. how do you navigate like this kind of discourse on social media, or like do you not engage, choose not to engage, or if somebody brings up a contrapoint, how do you address it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because like, uh, you know, honestly, it kind of depends on the platform. So, you know, like Facebook, I really am not like active. There's pictures of kids and like stuff like that, and it's more of just a, you know, element that way. And again, I think that if, you know, given the structure of social media, somebody might look at, say, a Twitter account like mine and think, man, that person's not really up for a conversation at some level. Yeah, and I recognize that. And, you know, I do think about that a lot, but Twitter is a really bad environment for discourse, to limit the characters, for so many people to be anonymous. You know, I think it's really, really difficult because everybody's willing to throw a grenade into a conversation when it's not connected to them at all. You know, so it's different. But I do think, you know, like Jonathan said, you know, if you were to look at both of our social medias, you wouldn't expect that we would have a conversation.
Super insightful.
I would expect that you would have a conversation with him more than you would have a civil conversation with some gun extremist. I think you probably would conflict a lot with, you know, real gun extremists, like you were criticizing the NRA.
Yeah, I mean, I do that is frustrating to me because, like, as somebody who, again, you know, I'm not like a crazy gun nut, but I enjoy them. And I do think that there's a defensive purpose and there is an inherent danger in that, but you work as hard as you can to mitigate that. Just like I do when I ride my motorcycle. I spend a lot of time practicing so that I'm proficient on my motorcycle, just like I do with firearms. And, you know, I do eat what I hunt. But, you know, what's frustrating on the more extreme side is when there's people without any of that commitment, but real passion for it. It is frustrating because it kind of paints people like me in a light that's extreme.
I love venison.
I have a quick question. We have 40 seconds. Did watching Jonathan and Joe talk change anyone's minds about guns?
No.
Not really.
I think it we needed a deeper conversation.
I feel like it's the NRA and the extremists that make you feel like you have to sit in a certain point of view and keep that. But the reality is, you know, being in Tennessee, like you realize a lot of people own guns and you have to find some kind of middle ground.
But we're really trying to finish on the hour. So I thought we could use the last 5 minutes if the group one moderator can either summarize in 1 minute the group's thoughts, or ask someone else to do it in 1 minute. So do you remember who you were, group one? Yes, it's Mark.
Yes. Sorry, I'm struggling to get the mute button off. Yes, I was in group one, and I would say we really spent most of our time dwelling on those beginning points of getting to know each other beyond just the specific issue at hand, and the sort of experience that each of us, our life experience, and how that environment has played a role in conditioning how we view these issues. And understanding that first, actually, and establishing empathy one another as people who've been through these human experiences to shape us, and then from there to move on to the particular issue. And we just cited the need for that, particularly now, a few days out from an important national election.
That's a very powerful point. I think as soon as you make the conversation human to human, as opposed to an abstract concept, it takes it to a completely different level. Thank you. Group 2. Where is the moderator for group 2? Okay, Margaret.
Well, our group was led the charge. We didn't really need moderator, which is great. But to sum it up, I think building on Mark's groups, getting to know listening to somebody else's perspective and background first, and then not being afraid to have the conversations and leaning in.
Great, wonderful, thank you. And group 3.
That would be my group. I think that, going to the human to human, we were talking about how the background of baseball kind of allowed for the trust building, which is really important for dialogue. It's not just the topics, it's actually the trust underneath. And someone gave the example of having a personal friend who's a gun owner and how that's shifted their ability to think. So, beyond the topic. And, we were talking about the need to prep, because if you bring 2 different groups that may not have the same, perspective, then it's hard to unhear what's said. So kind of that ability to kind of to be prepared. And we just looked at the ways that listening was role modeled, and how that kind of was shown and how they interacted. So that was kind of the discussion from our group.
Great. So you're saying we all have to learn baseball?
It's a first step, some sport.
Okay, thank you. Okay, group 4.
So with our group, we talked about listening to different perspectives, and that both speakers were being very civil during these conversations. So it was a very easygoing conversation. And then someone in the group mentioned that we had 2 awesome speakers, but would the conversation have been different if it was maybe a person of color or someone that identified other than, a white male?
Right. Yeah, so those are all good points. It'll be interesting to try to see those in action and actually create dialogue like that. So this is just the beginning. The whole point is to really just try and speak, and we're open to your ideas. It's been really wonderful. I appreciate John and Joe and the amazing discussion, and all of you, and millions of conversations with Mary and Samar. We have 60 seconds left. Millions, do you want to say something? Anyone with last words?
Turn it over to Summer.
Well, so Aya wants to have the last word. So, but I think I'm going to ask Sabina to actually take the last word.
Well, I have to say, I enjoy the conversation and sitting down and listening. I think you have to take out the background noises of the really polarized, whether it's organizations, social, we talk about social media, and really when we start to talk, I think there was just more in common. And even when there wasn't, even when there's just disagreement, there was more willingness to, well, why do you think the way you think? And so you're willing to listen. I don't think we're going to get beyond, we can't solve problems until we really listen and understand where each of us is coming, where our perspective is coming from. So thank you so much, Tariq, and Samar for putting this together.
Great. Thank you all. And on that wonderful note, we've actually made our 60 minutes. So at least we did that. Thank you all, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you.
Bye.